Imagine this. You're standing in a crowded room, surrounded by laughter, conversation, the hum of human connection. Bodies press against bodies. Voices overlap in a symphony of social choreography. Everyone seems to know the steps to this dance except you. You watch them move through the invisible threads that bind people together, the inside jokes, the casual touches, the unspoken language of belonging. And yet, you feel nothing. Not shyness. Not social anxiety in the conventional sense. Something deeper, more unsettling. It's as if you're watching life through soundproof glass. Present but fundamentally separate. Visible but somehow unseen. In this video, we will uncover the psychology behind people who walk alone, drawing upon the profound insights of Carl Jung, one of the greatest minds in analytical psychology. By the end, you'll understand not only why some souls travel without companions, but also what hidden strength lies in solitude. And stay until the end, because the final revelation may completely change how you see yourself and the people around you. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. You're about to discover truths that could reshape your understanding of human connection, self-awareness, and the mysterious nature of solitude. Now ask yourself this. What if the absence of friends isn't a failure of character, but a revelation of consciousness? What if the loneliness that haunts certain souls isn't a deficit but a signal, a psychological alarm, indicating that something within them has evolved beyond the ordinary patterns of human connection? Consider the paradox that defines our age. We live in the most connected era in human history. Social media promises endless networks. Cities overflow with millions of potential companions. Technology has collapsed the barriers of distance and time. And yet, loneliness has become an epidemic. More people than ever report having no close friends, no one to call in a crisis, no one who truly knows them. The infrastructure of connection has never been more sophisticated, but the experience of genuine intimacy has never felt more elusive. But here's what disturbs the comfortable narrative of modern loneliness. Some people aren't lonely because they failed at the social game. They're lonely because they've stopped playing it. Not out of bitterness or defeat, but from a growing recognition that something about the game itself feels fundamentally false. They sense that most social exchanges are performances, elaborate rituals designed to avoid the very intimacy they claim to seek. They watch people collect friends like trophies, accumulate followers like currency, and mistake visibility for connection. And somewhere deep within themselves, they refuse to participate in what feels like a collective delusion. More people than ever report having no close friends, no one to call in a crisis, no one who truly knows them. The infrastructure of connection has never been more sophisticated, but the experience of genuine intimacy has never felt more elusive. But here's what disturbs the comfortable narrative of modern loneliness. Some people aren't lonely because they failed at the social game. They're lonely because they've stopped playing it. Not out of bitterness or defeat, but from a growing recognition that something about the game itself feels fundamentally false. They sense that most social exchanges are performances, elaborate rituals designed to avoid the very intimacy they claim to seek. They watch people collect friends like trophies, accumulate followers like currency, and mistake visibility for connection. And somewhere deep within themselves, they refuse to participate in what feels like a collective delusion. Carl Jung understood something that modern psychology often forgets. The human psyche is not designed for comfort, but for truth. And truth, he knew, often requires a descent into the most terrifying landscape of all, the landscape of your own solitude. He saw that certain individuals are marked, chosen perhaps, for a journey that cannot be taken in crowds. These are the ones who feel the weight of superficial conversation like a physical pain, who experience small talk as a form of spiritual suffocation, who would rather sit in silence than engage in the elaborate pretense of connection that passes for friendship in the modern world. But society pathologizes this. It tells these solitary souls that they are broken, deficient, socially inept. It prescribes therapy to fix their withdrawal, medication to numb their alienation, self-help books to teach them the skills of friendship, as if authenticity were a technique to be learned, as if depth were a strategy to be deployed, as if the soul's hunger for genuine encounter could be satisfied with the empty calories of networking events and superficial bonding. What if we've been asking the wrong question all along? What if the real question isn't why do some people have no friends, but rather, what do people without friends see that others refuse to acknowledge? What if their solitude isn't a problem to be solved, but a stage of psychological evolution, a necessary exile from the collective dream before something more authentic can emerge? Jung called this process individuation. He understood it as the most important journey a human being can undertake. The journey from the false self, the mask we wear to gain approval, to the true self, the core of our being that exists beneath all social conditioning. And he knew something crucial. This journey cannot be completed in company. At some point, every genuine seeker must face the desert alone. The people without friends may not be failing at life. They may be succeeding at something far more difficult and far more rare. They may be refusing to betray themselves for the comfort of belonging. They may be holding out for connections that honor the depth of their inner world rather than demanding they flatten themselves to fit the shallow containers most relationships offer. They may be living in that terrible sacred space between the death of the false self and the birth of something real. But here's what makes this unbearable. Solitude without understanding becomes prison. Isolation without purpose becomes despair. And our culture offers no map for this territory, no validation for this stage of development. It only whispers that you are strange, difficult, broken, that your inability to make friends reveals some fundamental unworthiness. So the question burns. What is really happening in the psyche of those who walk alone? What invisible transformation is taking place in the silence that society mistakes for emptiness? And what if their loneliness is not the problem, but the birth canal through which a new kind of human being is struggling to emerge? The answer lies in understanding what Jung called the persona, the social mask we construct to navigate the world. From childhood, we are trained to perform. We learn which smiles earn approval, which words gain acceptance, which versions of ourselves are rewarded with belonging. Layer by layer, we build an identity designed not to reveal who we are, but to conceal it. We become actors in a play we never auditioned for, speaking lines we never wrote, playing roles that feel increasingly alien to our inner truth. Most people never question this arrangement. They wear their masks so long they forget there's a face beneath. They mistake the performance for reality, the role for identity. They move through life in a kind of psychological sleepwalk, comfortable in their conformity, safe in their sameness. And this, Jung understood, is precisely what the collective unconscious demands, that we subordinate our individual truth to the shared dream, that we sacrifice authenticity for acceptance. But some people cannot do this. Something within them rebels. Perhaps they were born with a heightened sensitivity, an ability to detect the falseness that others overlook. Perhaps early trauma taught them that relationships built on masks inevitably collapse. Perhaps their inner world simply grew too vivid, too complex, too demanding to be compressed into the narrow categories society offers. Whatever the cause, they begin to feel what Jung called the split, a growing chasm between who they pretend to be and who they actually are. This is where the friendship problem truly begins. Because friendship, as it's commonly practiced, requires a mutual agreement to stay at the surface. It operates on an unspoken contract. I won't look too closely at your mask if you don't look too closely at mine. We'll share activities, exchange pleasantries, offer companionship, but we won't venture into the dangerous territory of authenticity. We won't ask the questions that might shatter the comfortable illusion. We won't demand that each other be real. For those who have begun to awaken from the collective dream, these friendships become unbearable. Every superficial conversation feels like a betrayal of their inner truth. Every social gathering becomes an exhausting performance. They find themselves nodding along to discussions that bore them, laughing at jokes that aren't funny, pretending interest in concerns that feel trivial. And with each interaction, the gap widens not between them and other people, but between their authentic self and the persona they're forced to maintain. Jung observed that this internal conflict often manifests as what he called introversion, not shyness, but a fundamental orientation toward the inner world. The introvert, in Jung's framework, draws energy from solitude and depletes it in social interaction. But this isn't a personal failing, it's a psychological reality. When your inner world is rich with meaning, symbolism, and depth, the external world of small talk and social performance feels like starvation. You're not antisocial. You're simply operating at a different frequency, one that most social interactions cannot accommodate. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this dynamic from a different angle. He wrote of the herd mentality, the human tendency to seek safety in conformity, to fear standing apart, to mistake consensus for truth. The herd, Nietzsche argued, is hostile to the exceptional individual because that individual's very existence exposes the herd's mediocrity. Those who think differently, feel differently, see differently, they become threats to the collective comfort. And so the herd responds with rejection, gossip, exclusion. It weaponizes friendship itself, wielding belonging as a reward for conformity and loneliness, as punishment for authenticity. This is the hidden mechanism behind much social isolation. It's not that certain people lack social skills or emotional intelligence. Often, they possess these in abundance. What they lack is the willingness to continue the performance. They've reached a point where maintaining the mask costs more than they're willing to pay, where the loneliness of isolation feels more honest than the loneliness of false connection, where silence becomes preferable to conversation that never touches anything real. But Jung's insight goes deeper still. He understood that the absence of friends often signals the beginning of individuation, the psychological process of becoming a whole, authentic individual. This process cannot occur within the comfortable boundaries of collective thinking. It requires separation, exile, descent into the unknown territories of your own psyche. It demands that you face what Jung called the shadow, all the parts of yourself you've been taught to reject, suppress, or deny. The shadow cannot be confronted in company. It rises in solitude, in silence, in the absence of distraction. And for many people without friends, their isolation is not accidental. It's the psyche's way of creating the conditions necessary for transformation. Their loneliness is not the problem. It's the crucible in which the false self is burned away, leaving only what is essentially, irreducibly, true. Now we arrive at the territory few dare to explore. What happens to the psyche when it dwells in prolonged solitude? What invisible forces are unleashed when a person lives without the mirror of friendship, without the daily feedback loop of social interaction? The consequences are both more dangerous and more transformative than most people imagine. First, understand this. Other people are not just companions, they are psychological regulators. In their presence, we calibrate our sense of reality. We check our perceptions against theirs, adjust our emotional responses, moderate our thoughts. Friendship acts as a kind of psychic anchor, tethering us to the shared world, preventing us from drifting too far into the subjective realm of our own minds. Remove that anchor, and something profound begins to shift. Jung warned of a phenomenon he called inflation, a psychological state, where the boundaries between ego and self collapse, where the individual begins to mistake their personal insights for universal truths, their subjective experience for objective reality. Without friends to challenge our assumptions, to offer alternative perspectives, to reflect back our blind spots, we risk becoming trapped in echo chambers of our own creation. The solitary mind, unchecked, can spiral into grandiosity or despair with equal ease. Consider what happens neurologically. The human brain is designed for social connection. Mirror neurons fire when we observe others, allowing us to experience empathy, to simulate their emotional states, to understand their intentions. But in prolonged isolation, these neural pathways begin to atrophy. Studies show that chronic loneliness triggers the same threat response in the brain as physical pain. The amygdala, our fear center, becomes hyperactive. Cortisol floods the system. The brain literally begins to perceive other people as threats rather than sources of comfort. This creates a devastating feedback loop. The longer someone remains isolated, the more anxious they become in social situations. The more anxious they become, the more they withdraw. The more they withdraw, the stranger social interaction begins to feel. Eventually, what started as a conscious choice to step away from superficial connections hardens into an unconscious pattern of avoidance. The person who once withdrew to seek authenticity now withdraws out of fear of judgment, rejection, misunderstanding. But there's another consequence, more insidious because it masquerades as wisdom. In solitude, the mind develops what psychologists call cognitive biases, systematic errors in thinking that distort reality. Confirmation bias intensifies. We notice only evidence that supports our existing beliefs about why we're alone, why others wouldn't understand us, why connection is impossible. Availability bias warps our memory. We remember the painful social interactions vividly while forgetting the moments of genuine connection. Attribution bias colors our interpretation. When we're rejected, we blame our inherent unworthiness. When others succeed socially, we attribute it to their superficiality. These biases create a narrative, a story we tell ourselves about why we have no friends. And this story, repeated enough times, becomes identity. I'm too deep for shallow people. I'm too honest for a dishonest world. I'm too sensitive to survive social interaction. These narratives feel like self-knowledge, but they're often self-imprisonment. They protect us from the vulnerability of trying again, from the risk of being hurt again. But they also ensure we remain exactly where we are. The solitary person often develops what Jung called a rich inner world, a landscape of imagination, symbolism, and introspection that others cannot access. This inner world becomes both refuge and prison. It's refuge because it offers meaning, depth, and complexity that external relationships failed to provide. But it's prison because it becomes self-referential, feeding on itself, growing increasingly disconnected from the shared reality that others inhabit. And here's what makes this particularly tragic. The very qualities that led to isolation sensitivity, depth, the hunger for authenticity, become liabilities. The person who withdrew because shallow friendships felt painful now finds that their capacity for pain has not diminished. They've simply redirected it inward. Instead of being hurt by others, they're hurt by their own absence from life. Instead of being disappointed by friendships, they're disappointed by loneliness. They've traded one form of suffering for another. And often, the second is worse, because at least the first came with moments of joy, laughter, connection, however imperfect. But Jung knew something that modern psychology often forgets. Symptoms are not just problems to be solved. They're also messages from the unconscious, signals pointing toward growth. The pain of isolation is not just pain, it's also information. It's the psyche's way of saying, something needs to change, something needs to be integrated, something needs to be faced. The question is, will the person hear this message before the walls they've built become a tomb? Here is where everything you thought you knew begins to invert. The escape from isolation doesn't begin with learning social skills or forcing yourself into social situations. It begins with a radical reorientation of consciousness, a willingness to see your solitude not as a problem to be fixed, but as a question to be answered. Jung discovered something counterintuitive through his own descent into what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. After his break with Freud, he entered a period of profound isolation, plagued by visions, dreams, and psychological turmoil. Most observers thought he was going mad, but Jung was doing something revolutionary. He was deliberately entering his own loneliness, exploring it, mapping its contours, learning its language. And from that descent, he emerged with insights that would reshape psychology forever. The first act of rebellion, then, is this. Stop running from your solitude. Stop pathologizing it, medicating it, distracting yourself from it. Instead, turn toward it with curiosity. Ask not, what's wrong with me, but what is this solitude trying to teach me? This shift from seeing isolation as pathology to seeing it as pedagogy changes everything. Jung taught a practice he called active imagination, a method of consciously engaging with the unconscious mind. In solitude, without the constant input of other people's voices, your own inner voices become audible. Most people fear these voices. They experience them as intrusive thoughts, self-criticism, anxiety, but Jung understood them as fragments of the psyche trying to communicate aspects of yourself that have been silenced or suppressed seeking expression. Begin here. Create space for dialogue with yourself. Not the surface-level thinking that occupies most of our mental life, but genuine conversation with the deeper layers of your being. Write without censorship. Let your hand move across the page without your conscious mind controlling what appears. You'll be surprised what emerges: anger you didn't know you were carrying, grief you never processed, truths you've been avoiding, desires you've been denying. The second act of rebellion is radical honesty, not with others yet, but with yourself. Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. You must be willing to admit the parts of yourself you've hidden, even from your own awareness, the neediness you've disguised as independence, the fear you've reframed as choice, the pain you've intellectualized into philosophy. But here's where it gets truly revolutionary. Once you've faced your shadow, you must learn to befriend it. Not reject it, not fix it, befriend it. Because your shadow contains not just your wounds, but also your power, all the energy you've spent suppressing parts of yourself, all the vigilance required to maintain your masks. That energy can be reclaimed and redirected. Consider the historical examples of those who transformed isolation into illumination. Thoreau withdrew to Walden Pond, not to escape humanity, but to discover what it meant to be human. His solitude wasn't rejection of society, it was research into the nature of authentic existence. He returned with insights that continue to shape how we think about simplicity, consciousness, and freedom. Or consider Nietzsche, who spent years in isolated mountain towns, his health failing, his philosophy rejected by the academic establishment. He could have succumbed to bitterness. Instead, he used his isolation to forge ideas so radical they would reshape Western thought. His loneliness became the furnace in which conventional morality. The third act of rebellion is this: redefine what friendship means. Stop measuring your life against the social metrics that never fit you in the first place. You don't need many friends. You don't need to be popular, well-liked, socially successful by conventional standards. What you need is resonance, one or two connections that honor the full depth of who you are. Jung spoke of the concept of psychological types, the recognition that people are fundamentally different in how they process reality. Introverts and extroverts aren't just variations on a theme. They're operating from different psychological foundations. An introvert forcing themselves to socialize like an extrovert is like a cat trying to swim like a fish, exhausting and ultimately futile. So stop trying to be someone you're not. Stop attending social events that drain you. Stop maintaining friendships that require you to perform. The fourth act of rebellion: cultivate what Jung called the relationship with the self, the capital S, self. The center of your being that exists beyond ego, beyond persona, beyond all the roles you play. This relationship becomes your foundation. When you've established connection with your own depths, you stop approaching others from a place of desperation or need. You approach them from wholeness. And paradoxically, this is when genuine friendship becomes possible, because you're no longer seeking someone to complete you, validate you, or save you from your loneliness. You're seeking someone to share the journey with, not because you can't walk alone, but because walking together enhances the experience for both. Start small. Seek quality over quantity. Look for people who ask real questions, who tolerate silence, who aren't afraid of depth. They're rare, but they exist, often in the places where thoughtful people gather. Libraries, philosophy groups, art spaces, nature trails. The final act of rebellion is perhaps the most difficult. You must learn to balance solitude and connection. Not choose one over the other, but hold both. Jung called this the transcendent function, the ability to integrate opposites, to find the third way that honors both truths. You need solitude to maintain your center, to hear your own voice, to process your experience. But you also need connection to grow, to be challenged, to be witnessed, to be transformed. This is the path Jung walked himself. After his years of isolation and inner turmoil, he didn't remain a hermit. He returned to the world, but on his own terms, with his own voice, carrying the wisdom he'd earned in the darkness. He formed deep friendships, mentored students, built a community of fellow seekers. But he never again lost himself in the collective. He'd learned to be alone without being lonely, to be connected without being consumed. This is the rebellion. Not against people, but against the false choices society presents. You can be deep and connected. You can be introverted and loved. You can walk your own path and still find companions along the way. But first, you must stop betraying yourself for the comfort of belonging. First, you must learn that the only friendship that matters is the one that honors truth. Here is the revelation that changes everything. The truth that Jung spent his lifetime circling. The insight that transforms isolation from curse into catalyst. You were never meant to find yourself in the crowd. You were meant to find the crowd in yourself. This is not wordplay. This is the architectural secret of consciousness itself. Jung discovered something that shatters our entire understanding of loneliness. The psyche contains multitudes. Within you exists not just your individual consciousness, but what he called The collective unconscious, a vast oceanic layer of shared human experience, archetypal patterns, and ancestral wisdom. Every hero who ever lived, every wise elder, every lover, every fool, these patterns exist within your own depths. You are not isolated. You are inhabited. The people without friends have stumbled upon this truth without naming it. Their solitude has forced them into the only place where this discovery becomes possible, the interior mansion of their own being. While others seek connection externally, they've been building it internally. While others collect relationships, they've been integrating archetypes. While others fear being alone, they've been learning that aloneness is ontologically impossible because the self is never singular. Consider what this means. Every conversation you wish you could have exists within you. The wise mentor you seek? It's an archetype you can access through active imagination. The loving friend who understands you? It's a part of yourself you haven't yet befriended. The community you long for? It's the internal dialogue between your many selves, the child, the sage, the warrior, the artist, the shadow, the anima or animus. Jung called this process individuation, but he might have called it multiplication. You are not becoming one integrated self. You are becoming a cosmos, an internal universe, populated with figures, voices, and presences that are simultaneously you and not you, personal and transpersonal, individual and universal. This is why solitude feels so full for those who've learned to navigate it. They're not alone, they're in constant dialogue with the depths. They're not isolated, they're in communion with something far vaster than any social circle could offer. They've discovered what mystics have known for millennia, that the journey inward eventually breaks through to the universal, that diving deep enough into your own psyche, you emerge in the collective soul of humanity itself. But here's the paradox that completes the circle. This internal richness doesn't make external relationships unnecessary. It makes them possible for the first time. Because once you've befriended the multitudes within yourself, you no longer approach others from desperation or need. You approach them from abundance. You're not seeking someone to complete you. You're already complete. You're not looking for someone to validate your existence. You already exist, vividly, undeniably, in your own awareness. And this is when genuine friendship becomes possible. Not the friendships of mutual dependency, where two half-people cling to each other hoping to make a whole. Not the friendships of collective conformity, where individuals surrender their uniqueness to belong. But friendships of mutual recognition, where two complete beings see each other's completeness and choose to walk together not out of need, but out of joy. The ultimate truth is this. Your loneliness has been a gift disguised as a wound. It forced you into the only place where real transformation occurs, into confrontation with yourself. It stripped away the comfortable illusions that social approval provides. It made you face questions that people surrounded by friends never have to ask. Who am I when no one is watching? What do I believe when no one is there to agree? What do I value when there's no one to impress? These questions are brutal, but they're also liberating. Because once you've answered them, once you've discovered who you are, in the absence of all external validation, you become unshakable. You carry your center with you. You move through the world anchored to something deeper than opinion, stronger than rejection, more real than any mask. And then the most mysterious thing happens. The right people begin to appear, not because you're finally fixed or normal, but because your frequency has changed. You're no longer broadcasting need, you're broadcasting presence. You're no longer seeking completion, you're offering resonance. And those who operate at the same frequency recognize you instantly. Not many, perhaps, but enough. Always enough. Jung knew this from his own life. After his break with Freud, after his descent into near madness, after his years of isolation exploring the unconscious, he didn't remain alone. He formed deep, meaningful relationships, but only with those who could meet him at the depth he'd discovered. He built a community, but a community of individuals who had each done their own work, who had each faced their own darkness, who could relate not from their personas, but from their authentic selves. This is the final revelation. The absence of friends is not the end of your story. It's the beginning of your real story. It's the blank page on which you get to write a new definition of connection, one based not on conformity, but on authenticity, not on need, but on choice, not on fear of loneliness, but on love of truth. You are not broken. You are breaking through. You are not failing at connection. You are refusing false connection so that true connection becomes possible. You are not alone. You are simply learning to recognize that the deepest form of company exists in the dialogue between your conscious self and the infinite depths within you, depths that contain, paradoxically, everyone who has ever lived and everyone who ever will. Walk your path. Honor your solitude. Do the work that only solitude makes possible. And trust that when you emerge, and you will emerge, you will not be lonely. You will be complete. And completion, Jung understood, is the only foundation from which love, friendship, and genuine human connection can truly grow. The person who has learned to be at peace in solitude is never truly alone because they have discovered the ultimate secret. The universe exists within them, and they exist within the universe. And there is no separation. There never was. There never could be. This is the truth your loneliness has been trying to teach you all along.